The war room of the Galactic Council had never been so silent. Dozens of species, some ancient beyond comprehension, others newly risen, stared at the holographic projection hanging in the center. A single human fleet, small by every measurable standard, was encircled on all sides by the combined armadas of the Council. There was no escape vector, no reinforcement route, no logical outcome except annihilation. "Open a channel," the Council speaker demanded, his voice trembling despite centuries of political control. The human flagship appeared on the projection, its hull scarred, its engines dim but steady. On the bridge stood a single figure, calm, upright, unshaken, Admiral Elias Varn. His eyes scanned the display as if he were studying a puzzle rather than facing certain death. "You are completely surrounded," the speaker declared, his voice echoing through every frequency. "Surrender immediately. This is your final warning." There was a pause, just long enough to stretch tension to its breaking point. The human admiral smiled. "I know," he replied. "That was the plan." Confusion rippled through the council chamber. Several delegates spoke at once, their voices overlapping in panic and disbelief. The tactical AI systems ran projections again and again, each returning the same conclusion: total human loss within minutes. Yet something in the admiral's tone unsettled them. "What? What do you mean?" one of the elder strategists asked, his voice thin with unease. Admiral Varn leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You've been studying us for years," he said. "You've watched our wars, analyzed our tactics, cataloged our weaknesses." He paused. "But you never understood one thing." The holographic map flickered. "All of your ships," the Admiral continued, "in one place. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the human fleet moved. Not outward, not in retreat. Inward. Every human vessel ignited its drives at once, plunging deeper into the center of the encirclement. Shockwaves rippled through space as their formation tightened, collapsing into a dense, impossible configuration. "Are they insane?" one council member shouted. "No," another whispered. "They're concentrating." A blinding pulse erupted from the human formation. It wasn't a weapon the council recognized. Not a beam, not a missile, not a singularity device. It was something else. A distortion. Space itself bent inward, folding like fabric pulled too tight. Council ships nearest the center began to tear apart, not exploding but unraveling, as if reality had rejected them. "Disengage! Pull back!" the speaker shouted, but it was too late. The pulse expanded. Human ships, once scattered and vulnerable, now formed the core of a gravitational storm. Their technology, dismissed as crude, unpredictable, had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. Entire fleets vanished in seconds, not destroyed, erased. Panic erupted across every channel. Ships collided in their desperate attempts to flee. Command hierarchies collapsed as communication systems failed. Under the strain of the distortion field, in the war room, silence gave way to chaos. "This isn't possible," one scientist murmured. "They don't have the energy capacity for this." "They do now," another replied, voice hollow. "They converted themselves into it." On the human flagship, alarms blared. Crew members gripped their stations as the ship groaned under unimaginable pressure. But Admiral Varn stood steady, his expression resolute. "Hold the line," he ordered. A young officer glanced at him, fear flickering in her eyes. "Sir, if we maintain this, we won't survive." Varn nodded once. "I know." Outside, the storm reached its peak. The Council's armada, once the greatest concentration of power in the galaxy, was collapsing. Ships vanished into warped space, their signals cutting off mid-transmission. Escape became impossible. For the first time in its history, the Galactic Council faced extinction. Back in the chamber, the speaker slumped into his seat, staring at the fading projections. They sacrificed themselves," he whispered. "No," the strategist said quietly. "They sacrificed us. The distortion field began to contract. What remained of the Council fleet drifted, broken and scattered. Thousands of ships reduced to debris, thousands more simply gone. At the center of it all, the human fleet flickered, unstable, barely holding together. Then, one by one, their ships vanished. Not destroyed. Gone. The storm collapsed into nothingness, leaving only silence in its wake. Days later, long-range sensors picked up a signal, faint but unmistakably human. It came from far beyond the battlefield, beyond any mapped region of space. A simple message, broadcast across all frequencies. "Next time," the voice said calmly, "try not to gather in one place." In the ruins of their greatest defeat, the Galactic Council finally understood. Humanity had never been trapped. They had baited the galaxy itself into a single, fatal mistake. The message echoed through every surviving relay, replayed again and again as if the galaxy itself refused to believe what it had heard. Across shattered fleets and crippled command ships, one question burned above all others. How had humanity vanished from the epicenter of their own annihilation? Emergency councils were convened in orbit around dying stars and fractured worlds. The great powers of the galaxy, once confident in their unity, now spoke in hushed tones, their authority shaken. The word trap appeared in every translation, every analysis, every fearful whisper. Recovered sensor logs were dissected relentlessly. Frame by frame, scientists and war strategists traced the final moments before the distortion event peaked. They saw the human ships collapse inward, saw the impossible energy surge. But what came after defied comprehension. They didn't just generate the field, one analyst concluded, her voice trembling as the data unfolded before her. They wrote it. Fragments of theory began to align into something far more unsettling. The distortion hadn't merely destroyed space, it had opened it, tearing a controlled rupture into dimensions the Council barely theorized about. And, somehow, impossibly, the human fleet had survived the passage. Not survived, another corrected. Navigated. The implication spread like a chill through every chamber of power. Humanity had not only turned the Council's greatest strength into its greatest weakness, they had used it as a gateway. Far beyond known space, in a region untouched by any star chart, something stirred. A faint glow pulsed against the void, and from it emerged the battered remnants of the human fleet. Hulls were warped, systems flickering, entire sections of ships missing. But they were alive. Admiral Varn remained on the bridge, though the lights around him had dimmed to a low, unstable hum. The crew moved with exhausted precision, their faces pale but determined. "Report," he said quietly. "Fleet integrity at 40%, an officer replied. "Multiple vessels lost during transit, navigation systems recalibrating. But we made it, sir. We actually made it." For the first time since the battle began, Varn allowed himself a small breath. "Then mark the coordinates," he said. "We'll need them later." Behind them, the tear in space slowly sealed itself, leaving no trace of the path they had taken. No signal, no anomaly, nothing the Council could follow. Back in known space, fear turned into something far more dangerous. Paranoia. Alliances. Fractured as accusations spread, some claimed humanity had outside help, an unknown power lurking beyond the edge of the galaxy. Others argued that the humans themselves had become that power. Military doctrines were rewritten overnight. The idea of massing fleets, once the cornerstone of galactic warfare, was suddenly seen as a liability. "They turned our unity into a weapon against us," one warlord admitted grimly. "We handed them the perfect target." But deeper analysis revealed an even more terrifying truth. The human maneuver had required precise timing, unimaginable coordination, and a willingness to sacrifice everything. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a mindset. They didn't fear being surrounded, a historian noted. They required it. The phrase began to spread, whispered across command decks and training academies alike. That was the plan. Meanwhile, in the uncharted dark, the human fleet drifted in fragile silence, Repair crews worked tirelessly, patching hull breaches and rerouting failing systems. Every resource was stretched thin, every life hanging by a thread. Yet morale held, because they had seen the impossible and made it real. A young crew member stood by a viewport staring into the endless void. "Sir," she asked softly as Admiral Varn approached, "do you think they'll come after us?" Varn followed her gaze into the darkness. "They'll try," he said, "but they won't know where to look." He paused, then added, "And they won't make the same mistake twice." Across the fleet, a new set of coordinates began to circulate. Destinations no one had ever seen, regions no one had ever explored. Humanity was no longer retreating. They were expanding, and this time, they carried with them a weapon no council could counter, not just their technology, but their understanding of fear. Back in the remnants of the Galactic Council, a final report was issued, classified beyond the highest level, sealed in archives meant only for future generations. It contained a single conclusion: humanity does not avoid impossible situations. A pause marked the end of the analysis. Then the final line appeared: they create them. The classified report did not remain classified for long. Information had a way of leaking when fear outweighed loyalty, and soon fragments of the Council's conclusion spread across the galaxy. Worlds that had never encountered a human now spoke their name with unease. Trade routes shifted, border systems armed themselves. Entire civilizations began preparing not for invasion, but for unpredictability. Because that was the true threat, not human strength, human intent, deep within. The fractured council, a new division was formed, not to fight humanity, but to understand it. Historians, psychologists, war tacticians, even philosophers were brought together under one purpose. "How do you defeat an enemy?" one researcher asked. "That wins by losing." No one had an answer. Recovered battlefield recordings became required study. Cadets watched in silence as the human fleet allowed itself to be surrounded, as every logical survival instinct seemed ignored. But the deeper they studied, the clearer it became. It wasn't ignorance, it was design. They didn't fall into a trap, a senior instructor said during one session. They built it from the inside. That realization shattered centuries of conventional warfare doctrine. Meanwhile, long-range probes sent into deep space began returning anomalies. Not signals, not ships, patterns. Subtle distortions that hinted at something moving just beyond detection, something carefully avoiding direct observation, something watching. The first confirmed sighting came from a remote listening station at the edge of known space. The operator almost dismissed it as interference, a flicker, a distortion, a ghost in the data. Then the signal repeated, a human signature, gone before it could be tracked. Panic didn't erupt this time. It settled. Heavy, quiet, constant, because now the galaxy understood. Something far worse than invasion. Humanity could appear anywhere, and disappear just as easily. Back in the uncharted regions, the human fleet had grown, not in numbers, but in purpose. Ships once dedicated to war were being reconfigured. Some into exploration vessels, others into mobile shipyards, others still into something the crew simply called anchors, stability points, gateways. The impossible technology that had once been a desperate gamble was now being refined into something controlled, repeatable, reliable. Admiral Varn stood before a new projection, one that did not show enemies but pathways. Threads stretching across the void, connecting regions no one had ever linked before. "We're not just surviving out here," an officer said quietly. "We're building something." Varn nodded. "A network," he replied. "One they can't surround." Far away, in the remnants of the council, a bold proposal emerged. Contact, not negotiation from strength, but from caution. A small delegation was assembled, unarmed, lightly shielded, carrying nothing but a message and a question. They transmitted on every known human frequency. Silence answered. Days passed, then weeks. Just as the council began to assume failure, the area signal returned, not from a fixed location, from everywhere. You learned something, the voice said. It was calm, unmistakably human. That's good. The council delegation hesitated before responding. We seek understanding, their leader said carefully. A pause followed. Then, you had your chance to understand us before, the voice replied. You chose control instead, the delegation pressed on. And now? Another pause. Longer this time. Now, the voice said. You learned to live with uncertainty. The transmission cut. No coordinates, no demands, no threats, just a statement. And somehow, that was worse. Across the galaxy, something fundamental had shifted. Power was no longer measured by fleet size or weapon yield. It was measured by adaptability, by imagination, by the willingness to step into the unknown. Humanity had changed the rules, not by force alone, but by proving the rules were never fixed to begin with. In quiet corners of distant worlds, new doctrines were whispered, new strategies explored. Some sought to imitate humanity, though most failed before they began, because they lacked the one thing that made it possible, the willingness to risk everything on a plan no one else could see. And in the deep, uncharted dark, the human network continued to grow, silent, invisible, unstoppable, waiting. Not for war, but for the moment the galaxy forgot its lesson. Because when that moment came, humanity would be ready. After all, they had already shown exactly how they fought best. Surrounded. The legend of that moment. You're completely surrounded. I know. That was the plan. Didn't fade. It evolved. Across star systems, it became more than a quote. It became doctrine. Young commanders began studying the surrounded protocol, a term coined in hushed strategic circles. It described the deliberate act of allowing encirclement, not as a failure, but as a setup for asymmetric dominance. Most who attempted to replicate it failed spectacularly, because they misunderstood the core principle. It wasn't about being surrounded. It was about controlling what surrounded you. Deep within the remnants of the Galactic Council, simulations were run using reconstructed human tactics. Billions of scenarios, billions of failures. No matter how they adjusted variables, one constant remained. Human success relied on chaos, but not random chaos. Designed chaos. They turn unpredictability into a weapon, a strategist admitted, and then they step into it willingly. Meanwhile, reports continued to surface from distant sectors. Fleets would move to engage suspected human positions, only to find nothing. Or worse, to find themselves drawn into configurations eerily similar to the original trap. Clusters, tight formations, perfect targets. Even when humans weren't present, their influence lingered. Fear itself began shaping the battlefield. In one instance, a powerful war faction refused to group its fleets under any circumstances, fracturing its own strength across dozens of isolated units. When conflict came, they were defeated not by humans, but by their own caution. The lesson was spreading, but not evenly. Some civilizations adapted, others unraveled. Far beyond their reach, humanity refined its strategy further. The network of anchors expanded, each one capable of bending localized space just enough to create corridors, hidden pathways between distant points, not full distortions like the first event. Something subtler, something sustainable. Admiral Varn, now older, stood before a new generation of officers. The scars of the first encirclement still marked his uniform, but his voice carried the same calm certainty. You think the plan was to be surrounded? He said. Silence filled the room. It wasn't, he continued. That was just the moment. They noticed. A ripple of understanding passed through the officers. The real plan, Varn said, was to make them choose it. Elsewhere, the Galactic Council, rebuilt, but forever changed, issued a directive unlike any in its history, avoid total engagement, avoid full encirclement, avoid humanity. It was the first time a galactic authority had formally acknowledged fear as policy, and still, it wasn't enough. Because humanity didn't need war to win anymore. They needed positioning. In the outer fringes of explored space, new colonies began to appear. Not in clusters, not in predictable patterns, but in strategic dispersal. Each, one small, self-sufficient, and connected through unseen pathways, untouchable individually, unstoppable collectively. Trade networks quietly shifted to include human routes, though no one could map them. Messages arrived faster than light without using known relays. Supplies appeared where needed without detectable transport. It was as if humanity existed both everywhere and nowhere at once. They've turned the galaxy into their battlefield, one council observer noted grimly, and we don't even know where the front lines are. But the most unsettling development came from a recovered transmission. Old, buried deep in pre-war archives. It was a human training simulation, predating the Great Encirclement. The scenario? Total. Isolation. Complete encirclement. No escape. The objective? Win anyway. The final line of the simulation chilled every analyst who read it. If you cannot escape the trap, redefine it. Back among the human fleets, a new operation was quietly underway. Not a battle, not a defense, a setup. Signals were being seeded across contested regions, false weaknesses, apparent vulnerabilities, carefully crafted patterns designed to attract attention, to invite pressure, to encourage convergence. A young officer, reviewing the plan, hesitated. "Sir, if they respond the way we expect," Admiral Varn didn't look up. "They will," he said. "And when they do?" Varn's expression didn't change. "Then they'll surround us." The officer swallowed. "Again?" "This time," Varn allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "No," he said. "Better." The bait was subtle, almost invisible to those who weren't looking for it. Minor supply shortages reported on open channels, lightly defended outposts appearing along disputed borders, and fragmented signals hinting at disorganization within human-controlled space. To most it looked like weakness. To the cautious it looked like a mistake. But to those still driven by pride, it looked like opportunity. A coalition of ambitious powers, young empires eager to prove themselves, began to mobilize. They had studied the old disaster, memorized every detail of the encirclement that had nearly destroyed the Council. This time, they would be smarter. This time, they would control the engagement. They spread their fleets wide, avoiding tight formations. They advanced slowly, maintaining distance, ensuring no single point of convergence could be exploited. Every movement was calculated, every decision weighed against the lessons of the past. And still they moved forward, because even caution could be predicted. Human observers watched the approach from hidden vantage points, their sensors tracking not just positions but intent. Patterns emerged as the coalition adjusted its formation, small inefficiencies compounding into larger structural weaknesses. "They're adapting," one officer noted. "Yes," Admiral Varn replied. "Exactly as expected." The first engagement was deliberately uneventful. A human outpost resisted briefly before withdrawing through an anchor corridor, leaving behind just enough debris to suggest a narrow escape. The coalition advanced, tightening its perimeter, but not enough to trigger alarm. They believed they were in control. Weeks passed as the coalition pressed deeper, each system they entered seemingly abandoned just moments before their arrival. The humans weren't fighting. They were yielding ground, guiding the advance without ever being seen. "They're retreating too cleanly," one coalition commander warned. "Or they're afraid," another countered. That single disagreement was all it took. Doubt fractured unity, and unity had been their greatest defense. Small deviations in formation began to appear as different fleets adjusted according to their own interpretations of the situation. Gaps formed, not large enough to notice at first, but enough for humanity. In the quiet darkness between systems, the anchors activated, not violently, not dramatically, just a subtle shift, space bending, pathways aligning, connections forming between points that had never been linked before. The human network came alive, weaving itself around the advancing coalition. Invisible, complete. Back on the flagship, Varn studied the evolving map. The coalition forces were no longer just advancing, they were being arranged. Their cautious spread had become a web of isolated units, each one drifting into precisely the right position. "They think they avoided the trap," a junior officer said. Varn nodded. They avoided the old one. The first strike came without warning. Not a massive wave, not a central explosion, just a series of precise, simultaneous engagements across dozens of points. Human ships emerged from anchor corridors, striking isolated targets and vanishing before reinforcements could respond. Confusion spread instantly. Coalition fleets attempted to regroup, but every movement played into the unseen geometry surrounding them. The more they tried to reconnect, the more they exposed themselves. "They're everywhere," a commander shouted over a fractured channel. "No," another voice replied, panicked. "They're between us." That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't an encirclement, it was fragmentation. The coalition had not been surrounded as a whole, they had been divided, each piece isolated within a larger, invisible structure. Every fleet was now the center of its own trap. Back in the command chamber, realization struck like a physical force. "We didn't learn," one strategist whispered. Across the battlefield, human forces maintained perfect coordination. No wasted motion, no unnecessary risk. They struck only when advantage was absolute, withdrawing instantly when it wasn't. It wasn't a battle. It was control. One by one, coalition fleets were neutralized, not always destroyed but rendered ineffective, their command structures shattered, their ability to coordinate erased. Some surrendered. Others fled blindly, only to find themselves cut off again moments later. The galaxy watched in silence as the outcome unfolded. Not with the explosive finality of the first encirclement, but with something far more unsettling. Precision. Back on the flagship, the young officer who had questioned the plan stood beside Varn, watching the last pockets of resistance collapse. "Sir," she said quietly, "they never actually surrounded us." Varn's eyes remained on the display. "They didn't need to," he replied. He paused, then added, "We surrounded the idea of them." As the final signals faded, the battlefield fell silent once more. No grand explosion marked the end, no single moment of victory. Just the gradual realization that it was over. The coalition had come prepared to avoid the trap. They had not realized the trap had changed. And as human ships slipped back into the unseen corridors between stars, one truth settled across the galaxy with undeniable weight. The next time someone said, "You're completely surrounded," it would no longer be a warning. It would be a question. And humanity had already written the answer. The aftermath did not arrive with celebration. There were no victory broadcasts, no triumphant declarations echoing across human channels. Instead, there was silence. Deliberate, controlled, and far more unsettling than any show of force. Across the shattered remnants of the coalition, survivors struggled to piece together what had happened. Their logs showed no single decisive strike, no overwhelming force. Just a steady unraveling, as if their own movements had been turned against them. Ships that had never encountered a human vessel reported defeat. Commanders who had never seen the enemy face-to-face transmitted surrender codes. It didn't make sense, and that was the point. In the rebuilt chambers of the Galactic Council, the latest reports were delivered without commentary. No one dared interrupt, no one rushed to conclusions. The data spoke clearly enough. Humanity had evolved again. "They no longer need us to gather," one analyst said quietly. "They can build the conditions themselves." The implication settled heavily over the chamber. Encirclement was no longer a physical state. It was a constructed reality. In distant systems, neutral civilizations began altering their own behaviors. Trade fleets refused to travel in predictable lanes. Military patrols, avoided patterns altogether. Even communication protocols shifted, introducing randomness to avoid becoming part of something larger and unseen. The galaxy was adapting, but it was adapting reactively, and humanity had always been one step ahead of reaction. Within the hidden network, new developments were underway. The anchors, once experimental, had become stable nodes in an ever-expanding lattice, each one capable not just of connection, but of subtle influence over space itself. Corridors could be opened, paths could be closed, movement could be guided, without force. Admiral Varn, now more a symbol than a commander, oversaw these changes with quiet approval. His role had shifted, from leading battles to shaping doctrine, from commanding ships to guiding an entire way of thinking. "Control the field," he told a gathering of senior officers, "and the battle controls itself." They listened carefully, because now everyone understood the cost of misunderstanding. In one remote sector, a small incident demonstrated just how far things had changed. A minor conflict between two non-human factions escalated rapidly, each attempting to outmaneuver the other using newly adopted human-inspired tactics. They spread out. They avoided clustering. They tried to think unpredictably. Within days, both sides found themselves overextended, disconnected, unable to support their own forces. The conflict ended not with a decisive victory, but with mutual collapse. Human observers recorded the outcome without interference. Imitation without understanding, one noted. "Still dangerous," another replied, because even failure reshaped the battlefield. Back in council space, a radical idea began to take form, one that would have been unthinkable before the encirclement: decentralization. Instead of unified fleets instead of centralized command, the council began experimenting with distributed authority, smaller, independent units operating with limited coordination designed to avoid becoming part of a larger target. It was inefficient. It was messy, but it was harder to trap. "They're learning," a human analyst remarked when the data reached the network. Varn considered this for a moment before responding. "Yes," he said, "but learning slows you down." And in that space between adaptation and action, humanity continued to move. New corridors reached further into the unknown. New colonies formed not just for survival, but for positioning. Every expansion was calculated, not in terms of territory, but in terms of influence over potential futures, because that was the true battlefield now. Possibility. In a quiet observation post near the edge of mapped space, a human operator detected something unusual. Not a fleet, not a signal, but a pattern. An absence where something should have been. A deliberate gap. He reported it immediately. Within hours, the data reached Varn. "They're trying it," the Admiral said softly. Across the stars, a small coalition, different from the last, more cautious, more patient, had begun to mirror humanity's approach. They weren't advancing aggressively. They weren't reacting impulsively. They were waiting, shaping, setting conditions. For the first time, humanity was not the only force attempting to build the battlefield itself. The realization didn't bring fear, it brought focus. "Good," Varn said. The officers around him exchanged glances. "Sir?" one asked. He looked back at the projection, where faint lines of possibility began to intersect. "A predictable enemy is easy," he said. "An adapting one," he paused. "That's where things get interesting." Orders were issued not for immediate action, but for observation, for subtle adjustments, for the careful introduction of variables that would test the coalition's understanding. It wasn't a confrontation, it was a conversation. One fought with positioning instead of words. Days turned into weeks as both sides moved without appearing to move, shaping space, influence, and opportunity in ways no traditional map could fully capture. To an outside observer, nothing was happening. But to those who understood, everything was. And then, quietly, inevitably, the moment approached, a convergence. Not forced, chosen. Somewhere in the vast expanse between stars, multiple paths began to intersect, not into a tight encirclement, not into a chaotic clash, but into something new. Something balanced on the edge of control. On the human flagship, the young officer who had once questioned everything now stood at the center of operations, watching the convergence unfold. "Sir?" she said, her voice steady. "They're aligning." Varn stepped beside her, his gaze calm. "I know," he said. A pause, then almost to himself. "Let's see if they've learned the right lesson." Across the void, forces moved into position, not to surround, but to test, to probe, to define the shape of what came next. Because the galaxy had entered a new phase, not war, not peace. Something in between, where being surrounded no longer meant defeat. And saying that was the plan was no longer a surprise. It was an expectation.